Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are joining us from. Today's a special one because I'm broadcasting live from Tallinn in Estonia, but our guest today, Yisroel Wahl, is joining us live from New Jersey in the United States. Hello, Yisroel.
Hello, hello, hello. So excited to be back. It's been a while.
It has been a long time since we've had you on the Cat Life platform. It's great to have you back. I know you have a super exciting subject to talk about today, and we are joined by friends from three continents, at least four, in fact, four continents. Look at that. So if you want to let us know where you're joining us from, that's always good. Just drop us a line in the chat and we can pick that up. Yisroel, you might recognize a few names in there. And I've been watching the names come in from the registration. So most of our audience today is from the New Jersey, New York State area, and also from India as well. But let us know where you're joining us from. Alison is from Trinidad. Yair is from Israel, and Manish is from India. Namaste, welcome. So my name is Jim Sharman. If you're brand new to this, I'm the project manager at Catalife. But joining us today, the main topic is going to be led by Yisroel Wahl himself. I'm super excited to have you back here. I loved your last one. It went down an absolute storm with our audience, and I know today is going to be no exception. How are you doing today?
Amazing. Like really excited for this because it's a topic. I mean, I think we feel it's more prevalent now with COVID and everything and all that anxiety. I think we'll touch on why it's not necessarily like that, but it definitely is a topic on so many people's minds and so many people struggling with it. And I'm most excited because I think what we do here, more than anything else, is practical, real answers. And I hope that we're going to give that sort of information that truly is transformational for so many people.
Well, that's what I hope so too, because that is exactly a slap bang right in the middle of the Catalife philosophy, is to bring you real life examples of real life issues from real life coaches who have real life experience. And you are no exception, sir. But before we dig into this, just a quick disclaimer to anybody who's joining our webinars for the first time. We only have probably about 45 minutes worth of content and then 15 minutes worth of Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions at any point in the chat down there. If you stick a question mark at the end of it, I'll be able to pick it up and put it on screen later. We might answer those questions halfway through, or we might wait for the Q&A. So, but to continue, on our webinars, we can only usually scratch the surface of certain issues, this being no exception. So I just want to make something clear. Whilst we're going to be discussing obsessions, compulsions, and behaviors that clearly relate to obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, our primary focus is more on the anxiety that conditions like OCD create within people, today specifically within our children, right, Israel?
100%.
Good. So there are many, many resources out there available to people who want to dive more deeply. Yisroel himself is a resource who'll be bringing his skills and talents to Catalife through video courses. But today's webinar should not be seen as a diagnostic tool. We're going to be having a conversation about behavior and the anxiety that arises from behavior. There are numerous conditions which can be diagnosed that have anxiety-related behaviors central to them. And the key is to spot the patterns and address them, as Yisroel calls it, how to break the loop. And he will take us today through some important contextual background and help you to understand the primary issues, as well as offer us some practical advice on how to support our children as well as ourselves when stress behaviors, which can come from many sources, not just one condition, seem to take over our lives. So Yisroel, should I remind people what the learning points are today?
Yeah, I think that would be great because there's so much information. So if we could break that down into points, I think it would be very helpful.
Excellent. Okay, so after the webinar today, the aim is to help you understand how and why anxiety cycles occur when irrational fears strike, and understand what's better happening in your child's mind during these obsessive compulsions. The third one is learn how best to support your child positively through their anxiety. And then fourthly, to get to that, specific steps you can take as a parent to assist your child in overcoming and escaping negative cycles. So the first one then is to understand how and why. So kick us off then, would you, Yisroel? What's your starting point in all this? Presumably,
so I think before, just to break it down and jump in very quickly over here, because that's where we're getting to so much information. When we talk about anxiety in general, but maybe more specifically when it comes to anxiety that's related to obsessive behavior, we generally as parents look at it and say, oh, my child is so nervous or concerned about X, and therefore it does Y. In other words, I'm very concerned about, say, germs, especially now, it's a big topic. And therefore, I keep on washing my hands. Or I'm very concerned about the cleanliness. I need things to be a certain way. And therefore, I make sure that everything is all in place. And because of that, we often jump on that and try to reassure our children about the fact that it's not that way or something along those lines. And it's vital that we understand that often it's somewhat the opposite. That means because I'm struggling with this, obsessions, and because I'm struggling with this anxiety, because I'm uncomfortable, I therefore am acting in a certain way. It's not necessarily because I think X, Y, or Z will happen. And I think that's a concept that throws off a lot of people because it's very different than what we may be used to. And this applies in so many different situations. It can be even in fears, which we'll get to. But I just want to sort of put that down there and make that clear. We may be just focusing on things slightly wrong when we're trying to just convince our children that it's okay, instead of getting our children to become comfortable with all that's going on in their mind so that they can deal with what's going on in front of me. Is that clear?
It's clear to me, yes. If it's
Yeah, I
not
think
clear to anybody else, put your questions in, please.
yeah, it's just so different often than what we're used to. And I think we'll better understand that as we go along.
Sure.
When we're anxious about anything, I mean, we can be anxious about, my house burning down. It doesn't matter what it is. I'll often have different behaviors that I do in order to make myself feel better. I'll, look at something many times to make sure it's just safe. I'll, worry about it beforehand, plan things, and all that kind of things. When it comes to an obsession that's connected to anxiety, there's always a cycle. And this is the most critical concept in any way of addressing obsessions that have to do with anxiety. And what that means is that in any situation, there's a trigger. That trigger is something that makes me feel anxious, whatever it might be. It may even be a trigger that we don't notice. That means in a child's mind, for whatever reason, there's something that sets them off, that gets them to feel concerned, whatever it may be. And in our conversation, it doesn't matter that much. But whatever that is, and because of that, they will act in a certain way to relieve that sense of tension or that stress in their minds. So, as an example, I may be tense about, say I'm feeling nervous, something triggered me to be nervous about, again, germs, just because that's very classical. And therefore, I wash my hands many times, right? There's that cycle. Now, we said, and I want to be clear here, that it's not necessarily because of the anxiety, but there is a trigger that set me off. When I have that trigger, I become uncomfortable. When I become uncomfortable, I use a behavior to make myself feel better. Here's where the crux of the whole thing is. That behavior that I'm going to act upon makes me feel better in the moment, but also causes the anxiety to be worse. And this is where it's critical to understand. Say again, back to that example of washing my hands. I'm concerned about, I'm feeling anxious about being, germs and all that. I wash my hands. When I wash my hands, I trigger in my mind this concept of washing my hands will make me feel better, number one. And number two, it triggers in my mind that this thought about germs is very, very concerning. So I better do something about it. When I do that, what that does is that it'll help me in the moment, but it'll also cement this idea of anxiety and cement the idea that I need to do something about it, which then leads to me doing it again. And this becomes a cycle. And that really is the greatest struggle when it comes to obsessions with anxiety. Now, to be clear, every form of anxiety really has this. And at the crux of, and at the core idea of healing from anxiety, the way that I deal with it, this concept is maybe the most important concept. And what that means is that when I'm anxious and I do something about it, or I'm anxious and I feel anxious about it, or I'm anxious and I'm worried about having those thoughts, it creates a cycle that tells my brain that these thoughts matter, which causes me to focus on them more and causes my brain to be super sensitive to having them, which makes it worse. So there's a cycle that's occurring. It's not an idea of I'm anxious and therefore I'm washing my hands so many times. It's I'm anxious, I did something. That action started the cycle, which made me do something again.
Okay, so I'm hearing a very interesting thing here, which actually didn't come up when we discussed how to approach this topic in our preparations. But I'm hearing something that's really interesting, and I'm hearing root cause analysis. I'm hearing that the trigger happens for a reason. The consequential behavior is symptomatic of the response to the trigger, right?
1000%.
And the behavior feeds the cycle that we're trying to break. So we're not trying to break the anxiety cycle necessarily. We're trying to break the behavioral cycle so we can go in and address the cause of the trigger. Have I got that right?
100%. And this is the only, I hate slides, as you very much know, but this is the only time I would actually use the slide. And just imagine trigger, right? The anxiety, the behavior, and what that causes. And that just becomes a loop. It just becomes a loop. And I don't want to get too far off base here, but it does get to the core of everything. The core to healing from anxiety in general, and the key to healing from, an obsession anxiety is in many ways the same. The key is not that I'm not going to feel ever a sense of anxiousness. The key is that when I feel that anxiety, nothing happens. No cycle occurs. It enters my mind and it leaves. And that's it. And I go on in life. There's just no cycle happening. And this is not just with obsessions. This is with anxiety in general. That means I can be walking somewhere and I was anxious again about my house burning down. The thought entered my mind and nothing happened. Didn't trigger me, didn't make me nervous, didn't make me get overwhelmed. It just happened and left. And that's what we're really trying to accomplish. Well, we're looking at
is that the goal, to get people to is this the difference between a rational fear, like we're in the middle of a global pandemic which is spread by germs, and an irrational fear that if I don't wash my hands 17 times then my family will die?
Yeah, so that's a whole nother webinar. But yes, at its core, what we're doing over here is when there's a lot there, it won't work to work with rational fears. That's the short answer, right? If I see a car coming and I'm like, yeah, that thought that's coming in my head, oh, it's okay, right? It won't work because I'm seeing the car coming. It's actually only after I recognize the cycle and I recognize what's happening and I'm able to put that sort of name on it and say, oh, this is my anxiety talking, this is my obsessions talking, this is my all that I'm able to separate it and be able to say, take a step back. Now, this is a little bit more complex. In the classical CBT, we would break it down and be, is it rational fear? Is it not a rational fear? We'd break those things down. We can sometimes jump over that by just recognizing for what it is. But at its core, without getting too complicated, yes, rational fears, we're not breaking cycles. There's a fear about a pandemic. So hopefully, I take the necessary precautions and then I'm able to live life. Right? This is where it gets complex. When I take the rational precautions and I can live life, or I can't bear taking rational precautions because I feel like, oh, that's too overwhelming. A healthy mind, and again, we're going off, but this is so vital. A healthy mind can deal with anxiety. What that means is a healthy mind can deal with the fact like, oh, there's a pandemic. Oh, maybe I should do something, and then go back to living life. That's what we can do in a healthy space. When we're not in that healthy space, we either can't deal with taking precautions because then we're like, oh my gosh, that's so overwhelming, I can't deal. Or when we start taking precautions, we get so overwhelmed by it that we can't live life. So I'm going to leave that on the side because it's a bit of a side point, but it's essential for understanding what's happening. Healthy anxiety is not anxiety. Healthy anxiety is I have a concern, so I take care of it. Unhealthy anxiety is I have a concern, so it overwhelms me, and now I'm busy with that cycle. Is that clear?
So it becomes unhealthy when we obsess over it?
It becomes unhealthy when it overtakes us, when it's there, when there's nothing to do. If I feel concerned, say that I don't feel well, right? And I make an appointment by the doctor, I want to now be able to go back to living life. If I made an appointment by the doctor and I'm still so overwhelmed and I can't function, that's where unhealthy anxiety comes in. if I can't deal with calling the doctor because I can't even begin to think of having that fear because, oh my gosh, that's crazy and what's going to be, that's also unhealthy. A healthy anxiety level is I have a concern, I take care of it, and I go back to living life. An unhealthy anxiety is either I can't deal with that anxiety or when it does happen, it overwhelms me.
So tell us what happens in the mind of a child, because we're rationalizing right now using our conscious thought processes that we've developed over decades of experience in life. I've got 20 years on you, so I'm way ahead of you. But anyway, the point, I remember what it was like being a teenager and not being able to necessarily rationalize these things. What's happening, for those of you who might be new to Yisroel, he specializes in mental and behavioral health issues in the teens and adolescents, so everyone from 9 to 16. What's happening in the mind of a child here, going back to our original learning
So
point?
I'm going to go one step back for 1 minute, and that is
Sure.
like this because you touched on it and it's so important. When we talk a cognitive, conscious thought process like we're discussing now, it does not change what our subconscious mind does. And this is critical, right? Anyone who ever struggled with any anxiety would know this. That means that I'm really nervous about something and I tell myself, don't be nervous. And look what it does. Zero, right? The world is I don't know. It's not there. The world it doesn't have many people who said I'm so anxious, and we're like, don't be anxious, and they're like, oh, okay, fine, I'm
Don't
good
think
now.
of elephants.
Exactly. Oh, that's a whole nother topic. But that's a huge topic. But the key is like this: the conscious mind doesn't. When I tell myself not to think something, where I understand why that fear is happening, it will not make the fear go away. And I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but just recognize that this is so critical because as parents, we try to convince our kids that it's not bad. What's happening is in the subconscious mind, the mind that he or she is not aware of, right? In that part of the mind, there's a process happening. That process happening is what's causing this cycle. When we tell it don't, that's not going to work. That's not going to make it stop. It's not going to make it go away. It's just the process is going to happen. And if in anything, it'll make it go worse. So don't want to go too far into that, but let's just recognize what's happening. There's a cycle that's happening, a cycle that I'm not conscious of, a cycle that I cannot tell myself to stop having, but I want to do what I can so that that cycle doesn't get triggered and my mind can learn a new way to process emotions so that it doesn't get overwhelmed by all this stuff and could just live.
Is this why in young people these conditions are so often misdiagnosed?
It's hard to say why, but what we do know, and this just throws me off every time. There's a stat that shows that with OCD specifically, it takes between, on average, 14 to 17 years until it's properly treated.
Years.
That is a ridiculous number. That means you got someone who's 12 years old, right? And starts struggling with this. On average, they're not going to find help until they're between 26 and 29. That's crazy. And that's literally why I do this. There are answers to our struggles. The answers, unfortunately, aren't there enough. And people are struggling endlessly. We got to take care of that. But it's unfortunately not diagnosed correctly too often, or at least not treated in the proper way.
Great. That serves as a very powerful introduction into how and why these cycles occur in our children. And you just reminded me what it was like to be a teenager with undiagnosed OCD. Should I tell that one?
Yeah, it's up to you. But...
When I was 14, I had an argument with my mother who said to me, why can't you have a messy room like normal teenagers? It wasn't until I was 33 that I got diagnosed with OCD.
There you are. There's the numbers, right? And you're right there in the chart. It's not even like it's not even off the charts. That's literally the standard. That's like what happens. And it's ridiculous. It doesn't have to be that way. It's just sad.
So Alison has just asked, is there a specific age range of children that this webinar targets? And you say you specialize between 9 and 16.
Yeah, I mean, so as we're talking right now, we're really talking about, just the overarching understanding. And this applies to children and adults. This is just the cycle of how it works. We'll get into more specific at different age groups, hopefully, in how exactly to relate it. But what we're relating, and I'm not going to focus too much on the exact age, because what we're relating here is how do we interact with our children in a comfortable way at their age stage. So I think as we go along, if I don't get too far off track again, we'll try to break that down a little more.
Okay, good. So speaking of breaking things down, so we have a nice little summary there about how obsession fuels anxiety, because every situation has a trigger. The act of responding to the trigger creates the cycle feeds the anxiety. So we break the cycle before we treat the cause. Right. Break it down for us a bit more. Give us some examples of what's happening. So now we're into, we're into the second point about understanding what's happening in the child's mind during the obsessive compulsion. And lead us into some specifics.
Yeah. So, I mean, the more classic, and it doesn't necessarily happen this way at all with germs. It's just sort of like the classical one, and all the books and anything you see is like, oh, the guy with germs. It actually has a lot to do with whatever in that child's mind is important. So it can be, and don't want to get too lost on this, but we find that it's often the areas which we actually are least inclined to mess up on is where we become concerned. That means a child who's actually careful about germs will often have obsessions about germs. So it's not, I'm not taking care of it, and therefore I'm obsessed to take care of it. It's, I have been taking care of it really well, and it's important to me. And that's where my obsession comes in. Find it with religion and religious crowds. I'm clearly religious, and you'll find it in areas where that child has importance. If that child has special importance to that religion, it becomes about religious rituals. If it becomes, and it can become with thought processes, it can come with, again, don't want to get too lost, but whatever the example is in that, with orderliness, areas which give me a sense of comfort by acting in that way is where I'm going to find that cycle happens, wherever that comfort exists.
So a child is seeking comfort.
Our minds are seeking comfort. And as adults, it's literally the same thing. We're programmed that way. We're programmed to do what makes us feel better. So we naturally do it. And that's part of what's almost tragic about the cycle. It's like, I'm not doing anything wrong. The mind is just trying to take care of what it needs to take care of. It's feeling this tension, so it takes care of it. That's all. And
the mind is trying to take care of some. Why?
Why? Well, why is, it goes back to our very core, and that is that our subconscious mind primary job is literally just to keep us safe. And it knows what safety is based on the feelings and the pictures that it's received throughout life. And this helps us understand it a little bit on a deeper level. A child learns to know what behaviors to do based on the responses that they're receiving from acting in that way throughout their life. That's why the first years of a child's life are so integral. A child who's learning to see is making sense of colors, is putting pieces together. It's literally interacting with the world, seeing how it feels, taking in those messages, and then basing my life off of it. What's happening with obsession and anxiety-fueled obsession or obsession-fueled anxiety, what's happening in those situations is this exact same thing. I feel uncomfortable. My natural urge is to keep myself safe. I do that by acting in a way that's making me feel better, but unfortunately is going back to that cycle, which is creating that loop, which is just getting me further and further stuck in this world.
So our natural urge is to keep ourselves safe.
It literally who we are.
Wow.
It's literally our basic DNA.
We learn that when? What stage in our childhood do we learn that?
So it's a good question. It's almost philosophical in nature, because what happens when a infant is born, right? Why do they cry? How much of it is a feeling of pain? How much of it is an automatic response? When are they learning exactly what? So exactly the age is a little bit more blurred. But what we do know is it's the very DNA, and we could go into this if we have time, because it's a fascinating concept, but it's the very DNA of who we are. That means in a quick example, and it may not be fully clear, but we don't have time to get too far into it. If you take someone who's never seen, who literally has never had sight, Their world, when they think of a chair, it's literally what feels like this. That's what a chair is. A chair is not what looks like that. A chair is what feels like that. If you give them sight later in life, very likely they would never be able to see no matter what, and it would overwhelm them completely because they've learned to take those messages and understand the chair through that feel. We're literally being built on our interactions and our what we receive throughout life. And that's why the longer we're stuck in that cycle, the worse off we are. When we learn that this is how it works, this is what makes me feel better. When my subconscious mind learns that, it's going to go back to that cycle until we break it. Again, I don't want to get too stuck in that, but the concept is literally the core of all mental health struggles. It's literally our body just trying to do what works. It's just trying to make it happen. That's all. It's trying to keep us safe, trying to function. And when it's not aligned, when our action that we're doing in order to make ourselves feel better is making it worse, we get stuck in a loop and we can't get out of it. So more practically speaking, obsessions will come in areas which are important to me. It is important to note that there's a question of whether obsession can be, whether I can have anxiety and obsessions. Can I have, talking about OCD for a minute, although I don't want to get too stuck on the terminology, can I have an obsession without a cycle? It's more of a philosophical question because practically it makes very little difference. Practically, what we're seeing in an obsession, anxiety, obsessive anxiety, is a cycle of I have an obsession and I have a compulsion. I act on that compulsion. It fuels my obsession. The one thing that I would say, and talking fast here, but the one thing that I would say is sometimes that obsession, sometimes the hardest things to deal with are obsessions that we are least comfortable with. Obsessions that I want to hurt someone. I'm going to hurt my child, or a child's going to hurt, right? A child's going to hurt another child, hurt their siblings. Those are very difficult because the feeling of anxiety over it is larger. And I think as we understand that cycle, we'll understand how true that is. The more I'm triggered by the feeling, the more it's going to lead to a cycle. So in short, or to put it together, what's happening in our child's mind is a cycle. The breaking of the cycle is a healthy break in the cycle. And you know what? I'm going to give it over to you because that's really learning point 3.
Yeah, because this is a really good bridge. It's a really good segue actually, because we started off by trying to establish how and why things happen. Now you've been talking about what's going on in the mind of the child, and one of the words I'm picking up here is overwhelmed. So the child is overwhelmed by the sensation of anxiety, which has been caused by an unconscious feedback loop. So here's my next question for you, because I know this is probably what you want to spend the most time on. How can we best support our child? In your last webinar, we touched on how to deal with a kid who's acting out. Yet these anxieties, as we've discussed, are so real in the mind of the child, their behavior isn't an act at all. So what do we do?
So let's jump into how, again, don't want to get stuck on OCD, but let's jump in for just a moment into how it's generally treated, because it will help us understand the gold standard of what's accepted is what we call ERP, which is exposure response prevention. What that means is that in general, and you'll sort of pull things together, the way the OCD is treated best in general is through a exposure process. What that means is, say someone is, again, the classic example of germs, someone's going through that loop. And we'll get them to a point where they'll start practicing, maybe even thinking at the start, thinking about the idea of germs and not needing to respond or not responding. And what that does is that it starts creating a cycle, a new cycle or a new line. And that's the neuroplasticity idea. But a new line in my mind, which tells me that I can have this thought and be okay. In other words, what exposure does to us without a response is that until now the mind felt when I have this anxiety, I must act on it. What exposure does is I had that anxiety, I didn't act on it, and I was fine. That's what it does. And what that does is it starts creating a new process in my mind which says I can have that feeling and nothing happens. So that's how it's sort of generally worked with.
How do you work with it? Because I know you've got your own approach. So practice. So if I understood correctly, the goal there is to become comfortable with what's happening, to understand what's happening, and get the body used to not responding to it. So what practical tips have you got for me as a parent to work with my child to get them to that point?
Yeah. So the way I work with it is with the same concepts of exposure. I just find it to be tremendously more helpful, more powerful, easier, and longer lasting, like in every way better when we gain this exposure kind of through a different process. What we're going to do to help our children, and the same thing would really be with adults, just in a slightly different way. The way we're going to do with our children is for them to start recognizing what's happening. That means we're going to explain this to them. We're going to explain to them the process. We can explain to them how their brain is working on their level, obviously. But they can start understanding. There's a book, Up and Down the Worry Hill. That's a pretty good book. But there's different resources out there.
Which book is that?
I believe it's called Up and Down the Worry Hill. I believe. I could be wrong. Pretty sure it is. And it creates on a young child's mind sort of these concepts of how it comes together. And it talks a little bit about exposure, and it's just in a very child-friendly way. But we're going to help our child understand this. And then what we're going to get to is helping our children be able to recognize that I'm having this thought, and it's my, whatever we want to call it, scary man, okay? Whatever we want to call it, talking and making me feel uncomfortable about something that isn't actually true. What that means is we're not convincing them not to be worried. We're helping them understand the concept and getting used to the idea of I'm having a thought and it's my scary brain talking. Again, talking depending on the age of the child. Obviously, as you get older, you can talk more about, terms that are a little bit more mature. But it's my scary brain talking, and he is making me uncomfortable about something that actually I know I am okay with. What that means is that my comprehension, and this is why we got so cognitive about it, we got so much into that sort of understanding. When my understanding comes in, and we're going to talk about really pointers in a couple minutes, but when my understanding is understanding how my mind works, I can begin to start working with the concept of I get it. I get what's happening. I am okay, even though it doesn't feel that way. And what this does is it kind of does the exposure. And again, obviously, like you mentioned with the disclaimer before, and it's a disclaimer for a reason. Every situation is more, it kind of needs its nuances and all that. But to help us understand the general approach on what we could generally kind of do with our kids is when we understand what's happening, we start addressing it correctly. That means until now we're addressing it by giving them some, family accommodations, which always makes it worse, by the way. Right? It doesn't mean we should just force our kid to do things that are too hard, but accommodating it creates the cycle as well. It becomes I allow you to do it, so I need to do it, and my parents think I need to do it, and my parents are helping me do these things so that I feel better.
It's enabling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's even more than enabling. It's literally cutting the cycle deeper, and we do it without recognizing it, and that's why this webinar is so important. Right? We do it without recognizing. We do it without realizing what's going on. We're doing it just because we're trying to help our kids.
Right. So what's the opposite of accommodating it?
The opposite. I'll get there in 1 second because I think we need to go to the next thing. But what we're sort of understanding here is I guess we could talk about that as the opposite. But we're understanding what's going on, and then we're helping our children experience that. We're holding their hand, both figuratively and emotionally, while they're going through that experience, giving them the emotional support and strength and empathy while they're struggling to help them not have to do it. We're helping them live in that difficult situation without responding, especially because the child's understanding what's happening. That means if we would tell our children, don't act out, it's okay. Your brain is playing tricks with you. None of that's going to work. The first thing we have to do is we have to help them separate the two. Recognize the cycle. Recognize what's happening. Oh, that's what's happening. That makes me uncomfortable. And when I feel uncomfortable, I feel like doing this. But then it tricks my brain into thinking I always need to do this. Then we can start helping them and supporting them in that difficult moment, because it is so difficult. It's not easy. There's a reason why the struggle's there. There's a reason why people get stuck in it forever. There's a reason why they don't come out. There's a cycle that's difficult. But let's understand our role. Our role is not to make them feel better about the fact that they're nervous and say, no, it's not a big deal. Our role is not to say, hey, don't act that way. Our role is support, to be able to live in the moment and not need to respond in a way that will further the cycle.
So our role is to support our child to live in that moment and break the cycle. How?
Break the cycle because I'm learning, and that's where I want to jump into those pointers, but I'm learning how I can have those feelings. And maybe I should have made that more clear. I can have those feelings. It can come through my mind, and then it leaves. And we didn't make this clear enough. And let me jump on that. The cycle is not only about making the anxiety worse. It doesn't just create a cycle of I acted and therefore my anxiety learns that this is important and learns that I need to act this way again. It does something else as well. And what that does is anxiety by definition is a situation where I'm having an anxious thought and my body responds. I get tense. I get overwhelmed. That's what tells the anxiety to stay there. The same thought can cross my mind and someone else's mind. One person is struggling with this, one person isn't. And the difference is, by one person, that thought came into their mind and they were okay with having it. And therefore, the thought left. Mm-hmm. By another person, they had thought, they got overwhelmed by that thought, and therefore it stayed. When we're able to become comfortable with it and recognize what happens, a phenomenal transformational thing happens. What happens is that thought starts leaving. It actually goes away. It actually stops overwhelming me. It actually stops holding me hostage. But that comes because I'm comfortable with it and I don't get triggered by it. When we're helping our children experience those emotions, recognizing what it is, and feel good about what they just accomplished by not having to react because they understand what's happening, it will leave. It will start subsiding. It will fall away. But that happens as we experience it and as we become comfortable with it.
So the thing that breaks the cycle is no longer having the sensation of it being uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's the trick. That's what we as parents have to, that our role is, as a parent, our role is to get our child comfortable with the idea that, hey, it's just a thought, it will go away.
Yeah. And the tricky part about this whole thing is that it doesn't work through explaining. What that means is we're trying to train our subconscious mind. We're not just trying to train what I'm thinking. That means I have to experience this. We talked about that quick idea of like the way that my mind sees objects and sees our world as how it learns to work. That's not my conscious mind. I don't think about, I learned that lesson. I literally just walk and interact with the world and it's happening automatically. We're retraining our subconscious mind. That's what we're doing. So all our explaining and all our, however much we talk, is not going to do it. What will do it is those experiences of being in the moment, feeling comfortable with it, feeling like I accomplished by doing it, not being overwhelmed by those feelings. Those experiences are what retrain my mind to become comfortable with situations that until now it was very triggered by.
Okay, good. And the theory is great. The theory is fantastic. And I'm just wondering right now if we can take a practical example and then try to make a wrapper piece around this. I want to take one of the questions that's come in. May I do that, Yisroel?
Sure.
Okay, so this is about anxiety. So let's say you have a child who is maybe a little bit slower at learning than others, and maybe is discouraged by the thought that she's being looked down upon by her classmates. The trigger creates behavior, which is regularly making excuses of feeling unwell when it's time for school so that she attends school no more than twice a week, sometimes skips school for the entire week. And then what you've got is you've got a parent who's a single mum who's getting more and more frustrated and wants to give up trying with that child. That's coming from Alison. I know it's a huge one.
What?
It's a huge one, right?
It's a huge one. We need to do like 3 webinars on it. So how do we break this down? Children need to feel success before we even start. When a child goes into an environment of continuous failure, we sort of lose the moment, and I will get into, I want to get too far into this. We lose the moment of being able to get on their side, because however much support we get every single day, they're going into school and they have this sledgehammer going bang, bang. And I feel like it's like those, what do they call those again? Right? It pops up.
Whack-a-mole.
Yeah, whack-a-mole. And after a certain amount of times, only the whack-a-moles pick up, the moles keep on picking up their head. If I was the mole, forget it, I'm not sticking up my head anymore. Right? It's like I got bashed enough times, I'm not even trying anymore. So the first step, and this will kind of get into the steps that we were talking about, mentioning before. The first step is actually giving my child hope. We cannot expect a child to do something if they feel like they're never going to get there. If they feel like I'm going to go into school and it's not going to work. We got to build a dream, and we have to make that dream a little more practical. We actually talked about how to do that a little more in our first webinar. So if anyone wants to watch that, I think it's still live.
Yeah, it's on the website. Alison, have a look at that one, the previous one with you.
So we talked a little bit about how to build a child to actually start believing when they're in a space where they don't believe anything can happen. So before we kind of get anywhere, and this gets into the pointers that I really wanted to bring up, and that is the first step in the process is creating that dream, helping our children feel that there actually is a path. You cannot force emotional work. You can force behavioral work. You cannot force emotional work. It has to happen. You can't take a gun and beat someone and say, be calm right now, be calm. You can't do that. You can't do that because the gun is causing me stress and therefore I'm anxious. We have much less control over our emotional or subconscious mind than we think we do. We really don't have as much control as we want. So what we're trying to do is kind of get behind it and manipulate, not a great word because it has all those negative connotations, but manipulate the situation to create a positive cycle. The first step to doing that is create a world where the child actually feels like this can work, feels like there's hope, feels good about what they're doing. 2 keys to that, and I don't want to get too far stuck in it. Number 1 is creating the dream, but number 2 is really making them feel accomplished by each step of the process that they're taking. And this, again, we talked about more at length in the first webinar, which I think I very much advise people to watch. I think we went through some pretty key concepts that have to do with this question in many ways. But what we're doing is 2 things. We're creating a dream, but maybe more importantly, we're using something I called indirect explanation. I talked about that a lot. How to build a child to start feeling that what I'm doing matters. Now, once we have that, and we have a child who's feeling better about themselves and feeling better about the steps that we're taking, then we can give them all the support and love and encouragement. But because I'm together with you, we're on the same team. But if you have a child that's fighting for their very life and they're just trying to stay safe, like we talked about, safe doesn't just mean I'm not going to get smashed over the head. Safe means that I could feel like I can be me. But every day I'm going into school and I feel like a failure. So I don't feel like I can be me. It's very hard to get that work done. But once we can create that feeling, now we can be together with them. Now we can explain the process. Now we can give them the support. Now we can help them take the steps because they're feeling empowered and they're feeling better about themselves. So we didn't address the very specifics. I think that webinar does that a little better. But let's recognize the first step in the process of getting someone who's facing that feeling of failure is to create a world where they feel better about themselves. Once they feel better about themselves, now we can work with it and now we can play with it.
It's creating space. And you said this at the beginning about when we were actually first talking about this. You were talking about creating a space safe enough for the child to understand that it's not about them necessarily, and also as the parent, it's not about you.
Yeah, and that gets into really what we do as parents. I just went on a bit of a monologue explaining how much a child has to feel that they are okay. And that is the exact, we don't give ourselves enough room for this. The same concept applies to us. We can't force ourselves out of it. We can't convince ourselves out of it. We can't keep on pushing forward when we feel like failures. If I feel that my child's struggles are mine, if I feel that it's my fault, if I feel overwhelmed by it, what will happen is I'm not going to have the ability to work with it. The first step we have to realize is this isn't my fault. And it's not just words. I have to breathe in that concept. I have to take it in. I have to truly feel it and allow myself to accept it, not fight it, spend that time to recognize it. This isn't about me. I'm doing a phenomenal job. You're literally on this webinar. How many parents are anyway, right? You're doing everything you can to help your child. That's your job, and you're doing a wonderful job doing it. We have to be able to get over that hump if we're to help our child, because we have to feel safe. So before anything gets on, we have to be able to let go of that. And again, it's easier said than done sometimes. We're not trying to address every single point in this webinar because we would go on for days. But let's recognize the concept. I have to feel okay. If I'm not going to feel okay, it's not going to be doable. OCD is a beast. It's hard. It's hard to work with. It plays at us and knocks us at our weakest moments. It gets us frustrated right when we're finally getting things done, and then it comes up again. We gotta feel better about ourselves. That's number one. Moving into pointers. And moving on from there is really number two, and that is, like we talked about a lot, helping our child understand what's happening. But I guess before we go to that is number two, skip the piece here, and that means creating a dream. We cannot convince our child to do this. We have to make them feel that this is an answer. We have to build a dream. We have to build a dream of, imagine, and this is really tough for someone struggling with OCD to even imagine because they get triggered even by the thought. But imagine you would be in a space where you would think about germs, again, because we keep on talking about that, and you wouldn't be nervous about it, and you wouldn't feel any need to wash your hands. What would that mean for you? Imagine having that. Build that dream, build that interest, build that drive, because what we're trying to do is internal work. You cannot force that. You got to create that space of actually believing and wanting to do that. Two ways: drive and safety. Drive and safety. Drive comes from the dream. Three, and I hope I'm being clear here, is that safety. That safety happens from support and understanding. That means I am working on helping my child do this. I'm working on helping them accomplish it. I'm doing all that. But it's not coming because I'm forcing it down their throat. It's coming because I understand their struggles. It's coming because I understand how hard it is, and I also believe they can get better. That's the parts that I'm holding together. I'm holding, on one hand, I know how hard it is. Even though I know how hard it is, I actually know that you can succeed, and I believe in you. So I'm with you in the struggle, but I'm not going to say, therefore, don't do anything, because I know it can work and I want what's good for you and I want you to be without it. It's holding those two together that gives our child the safety to feel like I can let go a little bit of the tension because someone's there supporting me. Whereas if I just support my child and I'm like, oh, I feel so bad, they don't feel like they can. They feel like, oh, this is too overwhelming, because it's just my mom or my dad or both of them or whoever it is, my caretakers are busy telling me how it's so terrible. On the other hand, if I told them do this or do that, they're not going to be able to. They're just going to fight back or come and close into a shell, which is the more common situation when it comes to these kinds of things. Parents are trying to get their children, because we care so much about it, to not do it, and that just causes it to become a bigger deal, or things coming behind it.
They actually then pick up on your anxiety because you're
exactly, and that just
they're in
becomes
pain.
more of a cycle.
Yeah. So
What messages was that? It was like, oh, this is a big deal. Oh, you better not do that. Oh, thinking about that is horrible. Those are all the messages we get as children when our parents are giving us that kind of feedback.
So then so our children need a different kind of feedback, which means that we as parents need to be dealing with our own anxious thoughts in a way that we can rationalize because we're not children.
Right. And it's so much easier when we're not in the place. And this applies to adults as well. Like, I mean, when we're in the loop, it is impossible. It's like literally, I need to do this. And whatever you're right, that's what I feel like. As parents, we can see that loop. We can see it happening. And we can understand that it's so difficult. We don't understand how hard it is, obviously. We're not there, but we understand the concept that this is excruciatingly difficult. We also understand the concept that we can get out of it, and with the right support, and that us holding them while lifting them, we're able to get them to the next stage, and that they can really overcome this.
So then helping them to understand that it's okay not to feel okay, which
the key of everything. We could go on with this for a long time, but really the key to mental health struggles is one thing. I'm not going to go into it for a long time because I think Jim is like, chill with that. We gotta move up. Don't go back into your monologues again. But that's my fault, not yours. I'm the bad guy. I keep on doing that. I apologize. But let's jump on it for 1 second, if you don't mind. And that is like this: the key to mental health, literally all of mental health, is one concept: is just being okay with those emotions. Like, think about it this way: if I'm anxious, what's the key to being in a healthy space? Well, that thought might have crossed my mind and nothing happened. If I'm depressed, well, depression comes from something. And there are certain thought processes, or at least happening at the moment, that are causing that to happen. When I'm in a healthy space, nothing happens. It's just me living. It's literally, the key is equilibrium. The key is that things flow. Now, one of the greatest things that stop that, and this comes up a lot with addiction and other areas, especially later in life, a lot of people find struggle with addiction and stuff like that, and it's rooted many times in this key, is, have we ever learned to be in a situation that's tough and that's okay? Like, something happened and there is no answer and it stinks right now and I'm fine anyway. So all those concepts come together. And again, I could go into that and go into it for a long time. I don't want to, but because we're going to go off base again. But let's realize this key. The key is my child not even appreciating, but learning through experiencing feelings of overwhelm, and nothing happens and they're fine. Those are the experiences that train my mind, that create this new cycle that allows me to live a life where I can have an obsessive thought and I don't get any response. My mind doesn't go into overdrive because the neuroplasticity, the avenues that I've created, that I've learned now, are a thought can enter and I don't need to do anything. It's fine.
Wow.
That's really the crux of everything.
What a wonderful way to actually summarize 2 webinars.
Yeah, it's true.
Yisroel, the world needs your course, man. I know you can pull together a series of videos to address these things. Like, for example, Alison's first question, which I'm sure. Let me just read out to you what she said, because I know it's answered in the first one. It was about how should a parent handle a child who seeks to always be the center of attention, and when not given that attention, resorts to getting extremely noisy and disruptive, especially in the presence of visitors at home. That's the classic acting out. Now,
right.
So you addressed that in the first webinar. What we're addressing in this one is why they might act out. So what's the need? What's the cause? What's the thought? Oh, I'm not the center of attention. Why is that important? And you said earlier that kids will act upon what they feel is important to them.
Yeah. So I don't want to take that and automatically connect it to here, because we're focused on obsessive anxiety. Sometimes a child acting out will be, but it will get to the core.
It doesn't necessarily have to be an obsessive anxiety. You're right. This doesn't necessarily have to be.
It isn't necessarily obsessive anxiety, but it is touching on that core that you mentioned, and that is that I'm going to do what makes me feel better. That's all. Now, with the child, sometimes acting out doesn't even go that far, depending on the age of the child. Sometimes it's just, I'm uncomfortable, so I act out. Now, again, that would depend on their emotional maturity, a little bit more technical on exactly how to answer specific in this situation, X, Y, or Z. But what happens is my behavior, and this is the key of everything, my behavior that I'm going to exhibit as a child and really as an adult as well, but as a child is what's going to make me feel safe. It's what's going to make me feel better. Our behaviors are there for a reason. We don't act in ways that make no sense. We act in ways that make no sense cognitively, but subconsciously, it's following a very basic process. The process of my body, my emotional mind, my subconscious mind, however you want to define that, my subconscious mind trying to keep me at equilibrium, trying to make me feel better. And that's what it's doing to create that cycle. With a child acting out, it might be just because they can't deal with it. It's just so overwhelming. So it really depends on more specific more specific things. But the overarching concept is I'm uncomfortable. I want to feel more comfortable. And therefore I'm acting out. Not necessarily the acting out is making me feel better even, but at the very least, it's a response to that.
I do like the way you've wrapped that up. Actually, it's quite a decent conclusion. Actually, good news is there's no more questions coming, which means you've probably answered the questions that the viewers already had. But if you're watching the recording, and this is like triggering, if I can use that word, if it's prompting questions in your mind, feel free to drop your questions into the Facebook feed, for example, and then maybe we can look at those and answer those later. But the conclusion I'm hearing is, instead of trying to make our child or even ourselves feel better, what we do is we help them, or we become first comfortable with the idea that it's okay to be uncomfortable, and then we support them to get to the same space. It's okay to be uncomfortable with the thoughts that you have, because once they feel okay with the discomfort, it's no longer uncomfortable. Therefore, you're taking the fuel away from the fire.
Fuel away from the fire, and I'm building a new avenue. I'm teaching my brain that it can be in that experience. The brain that I'm not aware of, that subconscious response is learning a new way of dealing with it. Of that feeling can come, and it's okay.
And that's when you can actually show them the dream. Imagine a world where you don't have to feel like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I say about mental health struggles in general, and it kills me. It's almost like when we're struggling enough, when we're struggling too much, and we get that certain experience, we have this weight on our shoulders, and we can't imagine life without it. We're like in prison. All we see are the four walls of a prison. Like, we have to help even imagine a world without it, because this is their world. Their world is with anxiety, with those obsessions, and it seems insurmountable without that guide from outside helping them out. There's an old Talmudic saying, a guy who's in prison can't get out without the help of someone else. When I'm in prison, all I am is in prison. I can't get out. The guy outside can see the avenues, can see the places, can throw the rope, can work it through, can give me that guidance. That's the role that we're playing as parents. I'm going to go back to that disclaimer, though. We're like speaking for an hour and talking so much about this like as if I can take care of the world with an hour, webinar. We're giving maybe too many tools when we may not always be ready for that. Recognize that. The point here is just to understand the concepts, is to understand what roles we can play here. It's not about, therefore, you should be able to take your child out of it. These things are tough. They're tough for our child. They're tough for us. Get the help you need. There are people who deal with it. You know that. You would just tell me, like you were struggling with it so many years until you got adequate help. There are people. Get the help you need. Get that, because it is really tough. This is just supposed to be an overarching concept, helping understand the roles we may play, where we can come in, but recognize it's a tough mountain. We're not expected to deal with that ourselves, and help our children just overcome.
So what's next from you then in that? What's next? What can we expect from Yisroel Wahl?
So I would love to be able to put together some courses with Cattle Life, and I'm hoping to get that done. Hoping to get it done sooner rather than later. In general, you can reach out like on that Facebook feed, and we'll try to answer some questions as well. I put a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, as you know, so a lot of information there, and I'll try to answer what I can. But I'm hoping that we can be together, and we'll be able to create more practical tools, things that are more in depth and more step by step, and more helping us truly to overcome this for ourselves, for our children, literally the world. Too many people struggle.
You mentioned that we have enough material in here to tackle 3 more separate webinars.
Probably, at least.
One game. Some little quick feedback from Alison saying thank you very much. Both her questions related to the same 13-year-old girl, and she has said that there's great advice from this webinar. So my suggestion is to rewatch this one and also Yisroel's previous one. The link is in the chat there, and my colleague Erica has also, hopefully has put the link into the Facebook feed too. I can't see it right now. But speaking of Facebook, a question just came in. Yisroel, do you have any suggestions for parents to deal with their own guilt related to childhood struggles overall, not specifically related to OCD? Are there any good methods that you can recommend? Deal with their own guilt?
We're at the tail end of here. We need a new webinar.
We need a new webinar on that one. Okay.
But recognize that I would just say one thing.
You said earlier it's not your fault.
Yeah, and recognize what's going on because of our role as parents and how much it means to me. That's why that guilt is there. The guilt isn't there because I'm a failure. The guilt is there because I care so much. That doesn't mean it's true. That same concept that we've worked through with our child at OCD, when I want it so badly, that's when that guilt comes in. And sometimes recognizing that could go a long way because we start separating the two. But we would need a whole new webinar. Recognize it, though. Recognize what's happening. Recognizing it as guilt that isn't necessarily true. Recognizing it for what it is. It's me really caring about my child. And my child doesn't need me to be perfect. Literally, if we were perfect parents, our children would never learn that. They would be like, thank God I'm not that parent, so my children get to learn a lot. But I'm just saying, like that's not our goal. Our goal is we're helping our child. We're feeling guilty. Children are supposed to live in a world where parents kind of struggle too. That's part of life. The idea is that they can deal with that and work with that.
Excellent. So that's a good answer, which I heard you summarize into one sentence. The guilt's not there because I'm a failed parent. It's there precisely because I care so much for my child.
Exactly. Excellent. That's perfect.
If
I was on Instagram. That would be my next Instagram post, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, actually, we might beat you to it with that one, but there's another
Shoot
one.
It to me. I'll post it in different places.
There's another one that just came in. I actually quite like this one. I'm going to show this one on the screen. Oh. How to start a conversation with a 14-year-old girl who's brushing her teeth too long and too rough.
Great question. Great question. The difficulty I have with any specific questions is exactly this, is don't want to give too much about a specific situation because I don't know the details over there. But when the child can, the first thing we have to know before we even start there, maybe it's great that it was brought up because it touches on something which I didn't mention enough. Not everything is obsessive anxiety either. Right? Sometimes it's a child actually feeling a certain way. Like the first step is we got to just recognize what's happening, like what the child is feeling. Is the child doing this because they actually think it's going to make them look pretty and they think this is the way and they're not feeling comfortable about themselves, right? So we got to first like recognize why it's there. And that's sort of that first space. Like have that conversation about what's going on and let that be there. Now, once we're recognizing and we're saying, oh, this is an obsessive anxiety, as anxiety that's fueling things and it's becoming a whole process, then we can move into what we were talking about. The first step before we get anywhere else, though, is just have an open conversation. An open conversation of, I see you doing this. I don't think it's so good for you. What makes you feel like that? Why are you doing that? What are you hoping to accomplish? And let's discuss it. Now, we got to make that clear. They got to gain that knowledge. Now, if they truly feel like it's not helping them, but they need to do it, that's when we get into the whole obsessive anxiety piece. If they're doing it because they actually think it's going to make them look pretty, and like they don't look pretty otherwise, and they don't feel good about themselves, well, it's pretty classical teenage behavior, but the self-esteem piece comes in. There's a lot of different variables. I don't want to jump automatically into obsessive anxiety. I want to first just have that conversation. Why do they feel that way? What's happening? Where's it coming from? Can we educate them? Can they feel good in other ways? And then be able to move on and see, okay,
So,
what's the next step?
observe what's happening. Try to understand what's going on in the mind of the person who's doing it. Then you get close to why. And all that happens before you start dealing with what's going on.
Exactly. And that's why I love that question, because I didn't make that clear enough
Yeah.
during that webinar.
Brankita, I hope that answers. Gives you a start, at least, on how to proceed with that. So the starting point is to have a conversation to understand. And yes, of course, teenagers are difficult to open up to their parents. But weren't you? I was the same. Were you the same with your parents?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Weren't we all? I mean,
we all were. That's part of we can do a whole new, again, we keep on saying we can do a whole new webinar, but understand that the concept of teenager is literally about finding my own identity. That's what it is. So by definition, it's going to cause me to be difficult with my parents, because that's literally my background. Like what I'm trying to do is create a new identity. I cannot create a new identity if I don't kind of push against my parents. A teenager that just follows along and doesn't push back at their society, that's not so healthy. No, for real. Like we get so overwhelmed by it, but that's what a teenager is supposed to do. They're finding their way and finding their own world. If they would just stay within the confines of everything we told them, they literally aren't building their own life. That they're not creating a new person, then that would be tragic.
We need so much more from you. I mean, you have so many answers to so many issues that keep coming up. I've read the responses you get on LinkedIn. I've read the questions you get here, and Yisroel, the world needs you. So it's an absolute.
Well, thank you for facilitating and getting this to happen, because now the world is hearing.
Wow. Okay, we are over time. Thank you so much for sticking with us on this one. Thank you so much for sticking around, people who are watching us. If you're watching the recording, thank you for getting to the end here. Thank you for joining us today. Erica has posted how to follow us. There's more to come from Yisroel. There's more to come from us. So many more resources we can dig into and work together on. And we have to end it. I'm so sorry we have to end it. I love talking with you, but as ever, it's not about us. It's about you and what you're bringing to the world. So as ever, I want to leave the last word
about everyone watching, and hopefully we got to change the world. Give out that information that's life changing for real. More people need to understand. More people need to learn. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present, and we're looking forward.
Fantastic. Now, the last word is always a question, and the last word is Yisroel. What's the single biggest piece of advice or reassurance that you can offer anyone watching this, either live now or the recording? What's the single biggest piece relating to the topic?
The single? There are answers. That's the single piece of advice. And if you're not getting the answer, recognize that you're not. Like, don't keep on trying things that don't work. There are answers. When we understand it right, when we have the right direction, we get out of it. It's literally like a map. If it's so tragic to see so many people having maps that are obviously skewed because it's not getting them where they are. And if people call me up, it bothers me to no end. Every time you ask a question, I get stuck on some monologue, but it bothers me to no end. I've been in therapy for 10 years. I had a parent call me, I would say, I spent $250,000 on my child. I was like, hey, that's a lot of money, and where do you feel like you're at now? Like, he's like, maybe it helped. I'm like, maybe it helped. That's tragic. That's horrible. There are answers. Don't keep on going down paths that don't work. There are real answers. Find them. They're there. Get the help you need. Get your child the help they need. You'll get out of it. It's a prison, but there is a door out. You find the key, we can get out. That's my one piece of advice.
Thank you, Yisroel. You are one hell of a key.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
So thank you to everybody else. Don't forget to join us in the future. Leave your comments and questions afterwards if you're watching later on. I know we've got much more to come from Yisroel. Fantastic to have you again today. Thank you so much. Let's not leave this along the next time that we meet. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy.